Chicago, Illinois. It was 2:40 p.m. on Wednesday, September 12, 1928, when Paolo Rossi, carrying a leather valise containing $5,000 in cash and instructions from Al Capone himself, boarded the 20th Century Limited train at Union Station for the 18-hour journey to New York, where he would deliver payment and an extraordinary proposition to a 22-year-old colored enforcer who'd just successfully assassinated a stubborn bootlegger in Newark without leaving any evidence connecting the murder to Chicago or New York mob operations. Rossi, 38 years old in September 1928, served as Capone's primary representative for coordinating East Coast operations that required discretion and sophisticators, negotiation rather than the crude violence that characterized much of Chicago's bootlegging wars, had built his reputation by identifying talented criminals who could handle difficult assignments and by developing relationships that benefited Chicago's expanding operations beyond the Midwest territories that Capone controlled directly through his Chicago outfit. What Rossi was carrying to New York, beyond the $5,000 that represented payment for completed work, was an offer of long-term sponsorship that Capone rarely extended to anyone, and that he'd never previously offered to a colored criminal, regardless of their demonstrated abilities, an offer that reflected Capone's recognition that Harlem's growing policy rackets represented enormous future profit potential that Chicago couldn't exploit effectively without intelligent black intermediaries, who could operate within Harlem's Negro community while maintaining productive relationships with white mob organizations that controlled New York's broader criminal landscape. The young man Rossi was traveling to New York to meet a South Carolina native who'd survived Harlem's violent underworld through strategic intelligence and careful ruthlessness, was about to receive an invitation that would transform him from anonymous street enforcer to recognized power broker operating at the highest levels of American organized crime, establishing connections that would eventually make him Harlem's undisputed king for more than 3 decades. Harlem, New York. It was 9:15 p.m. on Thursday, August 23, 1928, when Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, 22 years old, walked through the heavy oak doors of the Cotton Club on West 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, wearing a dark gray suit that had cost him 3 weeks' wages from his enforcement work, carrying nothing but a straight razor tucked into his jacket pocket and a message for the most powerful gangster in America. The Cotton Club, owned by British bootlegger Onnie Madden and operated as one of Harlem's most exclusive venues, catered exclusively to white patrons despite featuring black entertainers, an arrangement that epitomized the racial contradictions of Prohibition-era New York, where black neighborhoods generated enormous illegal profits that flowed primarily into white hands, where black musicians performed for white audiences who traveled uptown for exotic entertainment before returning to their downtown apartments, where black gangsters like Johnson operated in the shadows of white mob bosses who controlled the real money and the real power. Johnson entered quietly with the controlled confidence of a man who'd been taught by William Bub Hewlett never to show fear even when facing death, scanning the smoke-filled room of well-dressed white customers drinking illegal Canadian whiskey at $15 per bottle, tapping their feet to Duke Ellington's orchestra, which was performing its regular Thursday night engagement for Manhattan's elite, who'd made the journey uptown to experience what they called the exotic Negro entertainment that Harlem provided. A doorman approached Johnson, a thick-necked Irish immigrant who'd worked for Madden since the early 20s, and asked with barely concealed hostility what business a colored boy had walking into a whites-only establishment through the front entrance rather than the service entrance in the alley where colored staff entered. Johnson said nothing, simply handed the doorman a cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax, the kind of envelope that immediately signaled important business from important people, the kind of envelope that made doormen nervous because opening it wrong or delivering it to the wrong person could result in serious consequences. The doorman examined the envelope, saw it was addressed in precise handwriting to Onnie Madden, care of the Cotton Club, with the words "Private and Urgent" written across the seal, and told Johnson to wait by the door while he determined whether Mr. Madden was receiving visitors who hadn't made prior appointments. Johnson nodded and stood with his back against the wall near the entrance, watching the white customers who occasionally glanced his way with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt, watching the black musicians on stage who saw him but showed no recognition because performers at the Cotton Club learned quickly never to acknowledge the presence of black patrons or black criminals or black anything that might disturb the white clientele's carefully constructed fantasy that they were visiting a Negro playground that existed solely for their entertainment. Approximately 5 minutes later, the doorman returned, accompanied by a thin man in an expensive pinstriped suit who Johnson recognized from Hewlett's descriptions as Jack Nossie Legs Diamond, one of Madden's top enforcers who controlled much of the bootlegging operations in uptown Manhattan and who was known throughout the underworld as a stone-cold killer who'd survived more than a dozen assassination attempts from rival gangs. Diamond looked Johnson up and down with the careful assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey, asked Johnson's name and business, received answers that were respectful but not obsequious, and told Johnson to follow him through the club's main room where white customers barely noticed another colored man walking through their entertainment space, down a hallway lined with photographs of famous white patrons who'd visited the club, past dressing rooms where black performers prepared for their shows, to a private office in the back of the building that was soundproofed and windowless and designed specifically for conversations that needed to happen away from curious ears. Inside the office, Oni Madden sat behind a mahogany desk smoking a Cuban cigar and reviewing financial ledgers that documented the previous week's bootlegging receipts from his various operations across Manhattan. Madden, 42 years old in August 1928, was a British immigrant who'd arrived in New York as a teenager, risen through the ranks of the Gopher Gang in Hell's Kitchen, served time for murder in Sing Sing prison, and emerged from prison in 1923 with connections to Dutch Schultz, Arnold Rothstein, and other major figures in New York's organized crime world. Immediately recognizing that prohibition had created opportunities for enormous wealth if one controlled the supply routes for illegal alcohol, the distribution networks to move product from warehouses to speakeasies, and the political connections to ensure police looked the other way when bootleggers operated, Madden had built his empire by being ruthless with enemies and loyal to friends, by understanding that in the Prohibition era violence was simply another business tool that needed to be deployed strategically rather than emotionally, by cultivating relationships with police captains and politicians and judges who could be bought or intimidated into cooperation. Madden looked up from his ledgers as Diamond escorted Johnson into the office, gestured for Johnson to sit in a leather chair facing the desk, asked Diamond to wait outside and ensure they weren't disturbed, and then focused his attention on the young black man who'd delivered an envelope that bore the personal seal of Stephanie Queen St. Clair, the most powerful independent numbers operator in Harlem and one of the few black criminals wealthy enough and organized enough to resist pressure from white gangsters who wanted to take over the lucrative policy rackets that generated an estimated $50,000 per day across Harlem's 30-plus policy banks. Madden opened the envelope carefully, extracted a single page of expensive stationery written in St. Clair's distinctive handwriting, read the message twice while his expression remained neutral, and then looked at Johnson with the kind of cold assessment that veteran criminals use when evaluating whether someone represents an opportunity or a threat. What Madden read in St. Clair's letter, and what Johnson had been entrusted to explain in person if Madden required additional details, was a proposition that could solve a problem that had been threatening Madden's business relationships with his most important partner. A problem that involved Al Capone and the Chicago outfit, and a territorial dispute over bootlegging operations in Newark, New Jersey, that was about to explode into a shooting war that would draw federal attention and potentially destroy the fragile peace between New York's various crime families. The problem, as St. Clair had learned through her extensive network of informants who worked in hotels and train stations and restaurants frequented by both black and white criminals, was that Capone needed someone killed in Newark, someone who'd been operating independently and refusing to pay tribute to the outfit despite selling beer and whiskey in territory that Capone considered under Chicago's control following agreements made at the 1929 Atlantic City Conference, someone whose continued independence was making Capone look weak to his own organization and to rival gangs who were watching carefully to see whether Capone could enforce discipline outside his Chicago stronghold. The target was named Vincent Tommaso Brescia, a 47-year-old Sicilian immigrant who'd arrived in Newark in 1912, built a small but profitable bootlegging operation during Prohibition, maintained fierce independence from both New York's five families and Chicago's outfit by cultivating relationships with local police and politicians who were content to take his payoffs rather than forcing him to align with larger organizations, and who'd recently made the mistake of expanding his operations into routes that Capone had specifically claimed as Chicago territory based on his investments in Canadian whiskey smuggling operations that moved product through New Jersey on its way to speakeasies throughout the East Coast. Capone had sent representatives to Newark in June 1928, offering Brescia a choice: work for Chicago and keep a percentage of profits, or retire from the business and avoid consequences. But Brescia had refused both options, claiming that New Jersey was neither Chicago nor New York territory, and that independent operators had every right to conduct business without paying tribute to distant gangsters who had no legitimate claim to Newark operations. Capone's problem, which was also Madden's problem because Madden's bootlegging empire depended on maintaining good relations with Chicago as a source for imported Canadian whiskey that came through Chicago's distribution networks was that killing Brescia using Chicago enforcers would be obvious and would trigger a federal investigation that neither Chicago nor New York could afford in August 1928, when the Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit was already looking for ways to build tax evasion cases against major bootleggers, when newspapers were publishing daily articles about prohibition violence that was creating public pressure for federal intervention, when Mayor James Walker of New York was facing corruption investigations that threatened to expose the connections between Tammany Hall politicians and organized crime bosses like Madden and Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. What Capone needed, and what Madden needed to help him acquire to maintain their profitable partnership, was a killer who had no obvious connection to Chicago or to established New York mob operations. A killer who could eliminate Brescia in a way that looked like random street violence rather than organized crime assassination. A killer who was skilled enough to complete the job successfully but expendable enough that if something went wrong, neither Chicago nor New York would face serious consequences. St. Clair's letter to Madden proposed a solution. She would provide the killer through her organization, a young enforcer who'd proven reliable in handling problems for black policy operators, who was unknown to police and federal investigators because he'd carefully avoided arrest despite working in Harlem's criminal underworld since approximately 1924, who was smart enough to plan and execute the assassination without leaving evidence, and who was motivated by the opportunity to gain the attention and potential sponsorship of the most powerful crime boss in America. The killer St. Clair proposed was sitting in Madden's office on August 23, 1928, a 22-year-old man nicknamed Bumpy because of a prominent bump on the back of his head, a South Carolina native who'd moved to Harlem as a teenager fleeing the segregated South where his older brother had been accused of killing a white man, a high school dropout who'd worked as a pool cleaner and dishwasher and newspaper seller before connecting with Bub Hewlett's crew and learning the enforcement business, protecting black-owned speakeasies from theft, collecting gambling debts from numbers players who hadn't paid their losses, intimidating witnesses who might testify against policy operators arrested by police, and occasionally eliminating problems that required permanent solutions. Madden studied Johnson for a long moment after finishing St. Clair's letter, assessing whether this young colored kid had the intelligence and the nerve to kill a connected white bootlegger in Newark without getting caught or creating complications that would bring federal heat. He asked Johnson how many men he'd killed. Johnson answered honestly, 3 men, all in Harlem, all problems that needed to be resolved permanently for various policy bankers who paid him for enforcement work, all deaths that had been ruled unsolved murders by police who didn't invest significant resources investigating black-on-black violence in Harlem's criminal underworld. Madden asked whether Johnson had ever killed a white man. Johnson said no, but that killing was killing regardless of the victim's race, that the mechanics of planning an assassination and executing it without leaving evidence were the same, whether the target was black or white, that the only real difference was police paid more attention when white people died, so the killer needed to be more careful about avoiding detection and creating alibis. Madden asked whether Johnson understood the consequences if he failed or got caught or implicated anyone in New York or Chicago in the murder. Johnson said he understood perfectly. If he failed, he was dead. If he got caught, he would face execution. If he talked to police, he would be killed, even if he was in prison. And if he succeeded, he would have earned the gratitude of powerful people who could provide opportunities for advancement that colored criminals rarely received in 1928, when most enforcement positions in major crime organizations went to Irish or Italian or Jewish gangsters who had family connections or ethnic ties to the established mob structure that controlled Prohibition-era crime. Johnson added that he wasn't afraid of consequences because he'd been living with the possibility of violent death since he was 14 years old working for Hewlett, that he'd survived the streets of Harlem by being smarter and more careful than other young criminals who'd been killed or imprisoned, and that he wanted this opportunity specifically because succeeding would demonstrate to people like Capone and Madden and St. Clair that colored criminals deserved the same respect and opportunities as white criminals if they could prove their competence and reliability. Madden nodded slowly, told Johnson that St. Clair had vouched for his skills and discretion, that Capone would be informed about the arrangement and would be watching to see whether this young colored kid could deliver results, and that if Johnson succeeded in killing Brescia without complications he would receive $5,000 cash and potentially future work from organizations that could use someone with his particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness, and invisibility to white police who rarely paid attention to Negro criminals unless they committed crimes against white victims. Madden opened his desk drawer, removed a manila folder containing photographs of Vincent Brescia, information about his routines and associates and business operations in Newark, details about where he lived and worked and conducted his bootlegging activities, and handed the folder to Johnson with instructions that the assassination needed to happen within 2 weeks, needed to look like a robbery gone wrong rather than a professional hit, and needed to be executed in a way that left no evidence connecting the killing to New York or Chicago organizations. Johnson accepted the folder, asked several specific questions about Brasher's security arrangements and whether he traveled with armed bodyguards, received answers that indicated Brasher was relatively careless about personal security because he believed his relationships with Newark police provided adequate protection, confirmed that he understood the timeline and the requirements for making the killing appear random, and prepared to leave Madden's office to begin planning the assassination. Before Johnson reached the door, Madden stopped him with a final warning. This job was a test. Success would open doors that were normally closed to colored criminals in 1928. Failure would mean death. And betrayal would mean not only Johnson's death but potentially the deaths of everyone he cared about, including St. Clair, who'd put her reputation on the line by recommending him. Johnson said he understood, thanked Madden for the opportunity, and left the Cotton Club through the back entrance reserved for Negro staff and entertainers and criminals who didn't use the front door where white patrons arrived, and departed. The next 11 days, from Thursday, August 23 through Monday, September 3, 1928, Johnson devoted to surveillance, planning, and preparation for the assassination of Vincent Brescia, operating with a level of careful, methodical attention to detail that would become his trademark throughout his criminal career, demonstrating the strategic intelligence that would eventually make him the most powerful black gangster in New York and one of the most respected mob figures across all racial and ethnic boundaries in American organized crime. Johnson traveled to Newark 3 times during this period, once on Friday, August 24, to identify Brescia's home and business locations and establish basic patterns of movement, once on Tuesday, August 28, to observe Brescia's routines more closely and identify potential opportunities for the assassination, and once on Saturday, September 1, for final reconnaissance and preparation of his escape route following the killing. According to notes Johnson kept in a small leather notebook that would later be seized by federal investigators during a 1952 raid, but that documented his early criminal career in careful detail, Brescia lived in a 2-story brick house on Bergen Street in Newark's Ironbound district, a predominantly Italian neighborhood where bootleggers and factory workers and small business owners formed a tight-knit community that was suspicious of outsiders and loyal to local criminals who'd grown up in the neighborhood. Brescia conducted his bootlegging business from a social club on Ferry Street, where he met with truck drivers and warehouse operators and corrupt police who facilitated his operations, storing illegal whiskey in warehouses near the Port Newark docks where Canadian liquor arrived by ship before being distributed to speakeasies throughout northern New Jersey. Brescia traveled between his home and his social club at predictable times, driving himself in a 1927 Packard sedan without bodyguards or armed escorts because he believed nobody would dare attack him in his own neighborhood where he was known and respected and connected to police who'd ensure anyone who harmed him would face severe retaliation. Johnson identified Brescia's vulnerability. Every Monday evening around 8 p.m., Brescia drove from his social club to his home, a trip that took approximately 15 minutes through streets that were busy with pedestrian traffic, automobile traffic, and the general activity of an urban immigrant neighborhood going about its evening routines, but that included several blocks where lighting was poor and police patrols were infrequent because the neighborhood was considered safe and didn't require heavy law enforcement presence. Johnson decided the assassination would occur on Monday, September 3, 1928, on Madison Street between Prospect Street and Avon Avenue, a poorly lit industrial block where Brescia's route took him past warehouses and small factories that closed at 6 p.m. and left the street largely deserted after dark. The plan was simple but effective. Johnson would position himself in an alley between 2 warehouses, would step into the street as Brescia's Packard approached, forcing Brescia to slow down or stop to avoid hitting a pedestrian, would approach the driver's side window as if asking for directions, would shoot Brescia multiple times at close range with a .38 caliber revolver that would be discarded immediately after the shooting, and would flee on foot through the alley to a stolen Ford automobile that would be parked on the next block for his escape back to New York. To establish an alibi and create confusion about the killer's identity, Johnson arranged for witnesses who would later testify to police that they'd seen a white man in workman's clothes running from the scene of the shooting, fleeing in the opposite direction from Johnson's actual escape route. The witnesses were 2 Negro railroad workers who'd been recruited through St. Clair's network and paid $50 each to be walking on Madison Street at approximately 8:15 p.m. on September 3, to position themselves where they could observe the shooting from a distance but not close enough to provide detailed descriptions, and to tell police they'd seen a stocky white man in his 30s wearing coveralls and a cap running east on Madison Street immediately after hearing gunshots. The false witness statements would send Newark police searching for a white suspect fitting a description that didn't match Johnson's appearance, would reinforce the theory that Brescia's murder was a botched robbery by a desperate white criminal rather than a professional assassination by organized crime enforcers, and would ensure police investigation focused on local suspects rather than looking for connections to New York or Chicago mob operations. Monday, September 3, 1928. The assassination of Vincent Brescia occurred exactly as Johnson had planned, demonstrating the careful preparation and cold-blooded execution that would characterize his approach to criminal operations throughout his career. At 7:45 p.m., Johnson positioned himself in the alley on Madison Street wearing dark clothes and a cap pulled low to shadow his face, carrying the .38 caliber revolver he'd purchased through Hewlett's connections from a corrupt police evidence clerk who supplemented his income by selling seized weapons back to criminals, mentally rehearsing the sequence of actions he'd need to perform in the next 30 minutes. At 8:07 p.m., according to police reports compiled after the murder, Brescia left his Ferry Street social club driving his Packard sedan alone, as was his custom, heading toward his Bergen Street home through his usual Monday evening route that took him past the Madison Street Industrial District. At 8:13 p.m., Johnson stepped from the alley into Madison Street approximately 50 yards ahead of Brescia's approaching Packard, positioned himself in the middle of the street in a way that forced Brescia to slow down, began walking toward the driver's side of the vehicle with his right hand held up in a gesture suggesting he needed assistance or directions. Brescia brought the Packard to a complete stop, rolled down his driver's side window to speak with what he assumed was a Negro laborer who'd gotten turned around in the industrial district and needed help finding his way back to the colored neighborhood, leaned toward the window prepared to give directions that would get this colored fellow out of the Italian district as quickly as possible. Johnson reached the driver's side window, leaned in as if listening to Brescia's directions, removed the revolver from his jacket pocket in a single smooth motion that took less than 2 seconds, placed the barrel against Brescia's temple at point-blank range, and pulled the trigger 4 times in rapid succession before Brescia could react or defend himself or call for help. The first shot entered Brescia's head just above his left ear, killing him instantly. The second, third and fourth shots were ensuring Brescia was unmistakably dead and that the murder would be classified as an execution rather than a simple robbery, sending a message to anyone who investigated that this wasn't random street violence but rather a professional killing by someone who'd been sent to eliminate a specific target. Johnson stepped back from the Packard as Brescia's body slumped across the front seat, dropped the revolver on the pavement where police would find it and waste time trying to trace its origin through evidence records that no longer existed, turned and ran back toward the alley where he'd been waiting, moving with the controlled speed of someone who'd planned his escape route carefully and knew exactly where to go and how to avoid being seen or followed. Approximately 40 yards away, the 2 Negro railroad workers Johnson had paid to provide false witness statements began shouting that someone had been shot, that they'd seen a white man running east on Madison Street, that the killer was getting away and police needed to be called immediately. Their shouts attracted attention from pedestrians on nearby streets, from residents in the few apartment buildings that overlooked Madison Street, from a beat cop who was walking his rounds 3 blocks away and who began running toward the sound of gunshots and shouting voices. By the time the beat cop arrived at the scene of the shooting approximately 4 minutes later at 8:17 p.m., Johnson was in the stolen Ford automobile driving at normal speed toward the Holland Tunnel and Manhattan, wearing different clothes than he'd worn during the shooting, having discarded his jacket and cap in a storm drain 2 blocks from the Madison Street crime scene, looking like any other Negro laborer heading home from an evening job in Newark to his home in Harlem. The Newark police investigation into Brescia's murder, which continued throughout September and October 1928 before eventually being classified as an unsolved homicide, proceeded exactly as Johnson had anticipated. Detectives focused initially on the possibility that Brescia had been killed by rival bootleggers, questioned associates and competitors and enemies throughout Newark's criminal underworld, found nobody who admitted to knowledge of the murder or who appeared to have clear motives for wanting business dead at that particular time. The false witness statements from the 2 Negro railroad workers sent investigators searching for a white suspect, a stocky man in his 30s wearing workman's coveralls who might have been a desperate criminal attempting to rob Brescia or a hired killer sent by unknown enemies. The revolver Johnson had used was traced back to Newark police evidence storage, but the trail ended there because the evidence clerk who'd sold it wasn't going to admit his involvement and because dozens of other weapons had gone missing from the same evidence locker over previous years, suggesting ongoing corruption but not pointing to any specific transaction or buyer. Newspaper coverage of the murder, which appeared in the Newark Evening News and the New York Times and several Italian-language papers serving the immigrant community, described the shooting as a tragedy, portrayed Brescia as a legitimate businessman who'd been killed during a robbery gone wrong, quoted police officials who promised to bring the killer to justice, while privately acknowledging they had almost no useful evidence or credible leads to follow. The Italian community in Newark's Ironbound district held a funeral for Brescia attended by hundreds of mourners, contributed money to support his widow and children, and quietly speculated about who might have ordered the killing and why. But nobody publicly suggested connections to Al Capone or Chicago or organized crime disputes over bootlegging territories, because doing so would attract federal attention and potentially trigger investigations that would damage everyone's business operations throughout northern New Jersey. What happened next, which would be discussed for decades afterward among criminals and law enforcement officials who understood the significance of the arrangement, established the template for Bumpy Johnson's rise from street-level enforcer to independent power broker operating at the highest levels of American organized crime. On Friday, September 7, 1928, 4 days after the Brescia assassination, Johnson received a message through St. Clair's organization that Oni Madden wanted to see him at the Cotton Club that evening, that the meeting would be brief but important, and that Johnson should arrive at 9 p.m. prepared to receive payment for completed work. Johnson arrived at the appointed time, was escorted to Madden's office by the same doorman and the same Jack Legs Diamond who'd supervised his previous visit, found Madden sitting at his desk in conversation with a stocky Italian man in an expensive suit, who Johnson didn't recognize but whose confident bearing and careful attention to Johnson's arrival suggested he was someone important, enough to be present for this particular meeting. Madden introduced the Italian man as Paolo Rossi, a representative of interests from Chicago who'd traveled to New York specifically to deliver a message and a payment to the young colored kid who'd handled the Newark situation so professionally. Rossi nodded at Johnson with the kind of respect that professional criminals show to other professionals who've proven their competence, said he'd been authorized by his employers, terminology that avoided naming Capone specifically, but that made clear who'd sent him to New York, to deliver $5,000 in cash payment as agreed, and to extend an invitation for future work opportunities if Johnson was interested in expanding his criminal operations beyond Harlem's policy rackets into areas that required special skills and special discretion. Rossi placed a leather valise on Madden's desk, opened it to reveal stacks of $20 and $50 bills arranged in neat bundles, counted out $5,000 while Johnson watched silently, closed the valise and slid it across the desk toward Johnson, who accepted it with a brief nod of acknowledgement. What Rossi said next, speaking with the careful precision of someone delivering a message that had been composed by his employers and needed to be communicated exactly as instructed, changed the trajectory of Bumpy Johnson's criminal career and established the relationships that would eventually make him the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld. The people Rossi represented in Chicago, he explained without naming them directly, were impressed by Johnson's handling of the Newark situation, by his intelligence in planning the assassination, by his discretion in executing it without creating complications or leaving evidence, and by his understanding that successful criminals needed to operate in ways that didn't attract unwanted attention from federal investigators or newspaper reporters who could damage everyone's business interests with exposés about prohibition violence. Chicago's interests, Rossi continued, extended beyond Chicago into various cities throughout the Midwest and East Coast where bootlegging operations and gambling operations and other profitable enterprises required reliable enforcers who could handle problems without creating new problems, where colored criminals who were smart enough and ruthless enough and disciplined enough to follow instructions could find steady work and substantial income if they could prove their reliability through successful completion of assignments. More specifically, Rossi said, looking directly at Johnson with an intensity that made clear how important this next part of the message was, Chicago's interests included New York, where relationships with local operators like Madden and Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano needed to be maintained through mutually beneficial arrangements, where the growing policy rackets in Harlem represented significant revenue that was currently being controlled by independent colored operators like Stephanie St. Clair and Casper Holstein, who might eventually need to be brought under more organized management through deals or through pressure or through transitions in leadership that Chicago and New York could facilitate together. What Chicago was proposing, Rossi explained, was a long-term relationship with Johnson as their representative in Harlem's colored underworld, someone who could work with St. Clair and other policy operators initially to maintain good relations, someone who could provide intelligence about Harlem's criminal operations that would be useful for future planning, someone who could eventually assume a leadership position in Harlem's policy rackets when circumstances created opportunities for transitions in control from the current generation of policy bankers to a new generation of colored criminals who understood the benefits of working with established organizations rather than trying to maintain complete independence in an industry that was becoming more organized and more dominated by major crime families with resources that independent operators couldn't match. In practical terms, Rossi continued, what Chicago was offering was sponsorship. They would make introductions to people Johnson needed to know, would provide capital for expanding operations when opportunities arose, would ensure police interference was managed through appropriate political connections, would support Johnson's rise within Harlem's criminal hierarchy in ways that would benefit both Johnson and Chicago's interests, and would expect in return loyalty, reliable performance when assignments needed to be completed, accurate intelligence about developments in Harlem's underworld, and eventual cooperation in bringing Harlem's policy rackets under more coordinated management when the time was right. The arrangement would be informal at first, occasional assignments that paid well and demonstrated Johnson's continued reliability, opportunities to work with Chicago's representatives on East Coast operations that required someone with Johnson's skills, introductions to people like Arnold Rothstein and Meyer Lansky and other major figures in New York's organized crime world who could provide valuable connections and opportunities for a young colored criminal who was smart enough to understand how the larger game was played. Johnson listened to Rossi's proposition in complete silence, his face showing no emotion beyond the slight narrowing of his eyes that people who knew him would later recognize as a sign of intense concentration, weighing the implications of what was being offered and what was being asked, understanding that accepting Chicago's sponsorship meant giving up the independence that colored criminals like St. Clair valued so highly, but also meant gaining access to power and wealth that independent operators could never achieve on their own in an industry increasingly controlled by major crime, organizations with political connections and financial resources that dwarfed anything Harlem's policy bankers could muster. When Rossi finished explaining the proposition, Johnson asked a single question that demonstrated his understanding of the situation's complexity. If Chicago wanted him to work as their representative in Harlem's colored underworld, how would that relationship affect his existing work for St. Clair, who'd been his employer and mentor, and the person who'd made the introduction that led to the Newark assignment in the first place? Rossi smiled slightly, clearly pleased that Johnson had immediately identified the most important tension in the proposed arrangement, said that Chicago understood Johnson's loyalty to St. Clair and respected it, that nothing they were proposing required Johnson to betray her or work against her interests at this time, that St. Clair herself understood, probably better than Johnson realized, that Harlem's policy rackets couldn't remain completely independent forever as organized crime became more sophisticated and more territorial about controlling profitable industries. What Chicago wanted initially, Rossi explained, was simply a connection to Harlem's colored underworld through someone they could trust, someone who could handle assignments when needed, someone who could provide accurate information about developments that might affect Chicago's business interests in New York. Eventually, Rossi acknowledged, circumstances might create opportunities or necessitate changes in Harlem's leadership structure, situations where Johnson would need to choose between maintaining old loyalties and accepting new opportunities. But those situations weren't immediate, and when they arose, Johnson would need to make his own decisions based on his assessment of what served his interests best. Johnson nodded slowly, told Rossi he understood what was being offered and what was being asked, that he appreciated Chicago's confidence in his abilities and their willingness to work with a colored criminal in ways that other organizations typically didn't, that he accepted their proposition for future work and connections while understanding that at some point his loyalties might be tested in ways that would require difficult choices. Johnson added that he was ambitious, that he wanted more than what street-level enforcement work could provide, that he recognized the policy rackets in Harlem represented the path to real power and real wealth for colored criminals who were smart enough to navigate the complicated relationships between black operators and white mob organizations, and that he was willing to work with Chicago toward long-term goals if they were willing to support his rise in Harlem's underworld when opportunities presented themselves. Rossi nodded in return, said Chicago looked forward to profitable future dealings with Johnson, shook his hand with the firm grip that sealed agreements between criminals who trusted each other's words more than any written contracts or legal arrangements, and told Johnson that someone from Chicago would contact him within the next few months with the first assignment under their new arrangement. After Rossi left Madden's office to catch the evening train back to Chicago, Madden looked at Johnson with the expression that mixed professional respect and personal warning, told him that what had just happened was unusual and significant, that Chicago typically didn't extend sponsorship arrangements to colored criminals regardless of how talented they were, that Johnson had impressed dangerous people who didn't impress easily and who would expect continued excellence in everything he did for them going forward, that the $5,000 sitting in the leather valise on Madden's desk represented both payment for completed work and an investment in Johnson's future potential. Madden added that Johnson should be smart about spending the money, should avoid displaying sudden wealth that would attract attention from police or from other criminals who might wonder how a 22-year-old colored enforcer had come into such a substantial sum, should use at least part of the money to invest in his own criminal operations, whether that meant buying into policy banks, or establishing protection rackets, or developing other revenue streams that would provide steady income and build a reputation as an increasingly powerful figure in Harlem's underworld. Most importantly, Madden said, with the gravity of someone offering advice that could save Johnson's life or ensure his death depending on whether he heeded it, Johnson needed to understand that accepting Chicago's sponsorship meant playing an extremely dangerous game, that he would be operating between competing interests and potentially conflicting loyalties, that black gangsters who tried to work with white mob organizations often found themselves expendable when situations became complicated, that the path Johnson was starting to walk had destroyed smarter men who'd made one wrong move or shown one moment of disloyalty or failed one critical test that their sponsors had administered. Madden told Johnson he'd vouched for him with Rossi and with the people Rossi represented, that Johnson's success or failure would reflect on Madden's judgment and potentially affect Madden's relationships with Chicago, that Johnson therefore had a responsibility not just to himself but to everyone who'd helped create this opportunity to prove that colored criminals could operate at the highest levels of organized crime if they were given the chance. Johnson thanked Madden for the advice and the warning, picked up the leather valise containing $5,000 cash, and left the Cotton Club through the back entrance, emerging onto Lenox Avenue at approximately 10:15 p.m. on Friday, September 7, 1928, a different person than he'd been when he entered the Cotton Club 2 weeks earlier to deliver St. Clair's message. 2 weeks ago, Johnson had been a street enforcer, earning perhaps $50 per week handling protection and collection work for Harlem's policy bankers, unknown to the larger organized crime world beyond Harlem, possessing skills and intelligence but lacking the connections and capital that could transform those assets into real power. Now Johnson was a paid assassin who'd successfully completed a job for Al Capone, a rising figure who'd been offered sponsorship by Chicago's most powerful crime organization, a colored criminal with $5,000 cash and the potential for much more if he could continue proving his worth to people who controlled millions of dollars in illegal revenue across multiple cities and multiple criminal enterprises. The transformation from enforcer to power broker, which would be completed over the next 7 years through 1935, when Johnson finally emerged as the dominant figure in Harlem's policy rackets, after Dutch Schultz's assassination and St. Clair's decision to hand over control of her operations, began on that September evening in 1928, when a 22-year-old colored kid accepted $5,000 and an invitation to play in the major leagues of American organized crime. What happened over those 7 years? The assignments Johnson completed for Chicago, the connections he developed with major crime figures across racial and ethnic boundaries, the reputation he built as someone who was simultaneously ruthless and intelligent and reliable, the capital he accumulated and invested in establishing his own operations, and the strategic moves he made to position himself as St. Clair's successor when circumstances created the opportunity, would establish the foundation for his reign as Harlem's undisputed king from the mid-1930s through the late 1960s. The first assignment under Johnson's new arrangement with Chicago came in January 1929, 4 months after the Brescia assassination, when Rossi contacted Johnson through intermediaries and asked him to handle a problem in Philadelphia involving a colored numbers operator who was trying to expand into territory that Chicago considered under their influence through partnerships with local Italian crime families. The target was a 38-year-old policy banker named Marcus Washington, who'd been operating in Philadelphia's Negro district since the early 1920s, building a successful operation that generated approximately $2,000 per week in profits, refusing offers from Italian gangsters who wanted to either partner with him or force him out of business, threatening to go to federal investigators if pressure continued from organizations he knew were connected to Chicago and New York mobs. Johnson traveled to Philadelphia in late January 1929, spent 2 weeks conducting surveillance on Washington's operations and routines, identified vulnerabilities in Washington's security arrangements similar to what he'd found with Brescia in Newark, and on Wednesday, February 6, 1929, approached Washington outside the policy bank he operated on South Street in Philadelphia's colored district, shot him 3 times at close range with a different revolver than he'd used in Newark, fled the scene using an escape route he'd prepared through alleys and side streets, and returned to New York the same evening, having completed the assignment exactly as Chicago had requested. The Philadelphia police investigation concluded Washington had been killed by local criminals involved in disputes over gambling territories, never developed leads connecting the murder to Johnson or to Chicago's interests, and closed the case as unsolved after 6 weeks of fruitless investigation. Chicago paid Johnson $3,000 for the Philadelphia assignment, solidifying their confidence in his reliability and his ability to complete difficult work without creating complications. The assignment also introduced Johnson to Anthony Fats Grosso, a Chicago operative who worked as Capone's representative in coordinating operations on the East Coast, who would become Johnson's primary contact for Chicago assignments over the next several years, and who would eventually help Johnson navigate the complicated political and criminal alliances that controlled organized crime in New York during the transition from the Prohibition era to the post-Prohibition period, when gambling and drug trafficking became the primary revenue sources for major crime families. Through 1929 and 1930, Johnson completed 5 more assignments for Chicago, 3 assassinations of targets who were creating problems for mob operations in various East Coast cities, 2 intimidation jobs where Chicago needed to send messages to people who were considering cooperation with federal investigators or who were refusing to accept Chicago's terms for business partnerships. Each successful assignment strengthened Johnson's reputation within organized crime circles as a reliable professional who could be trusted with sensitive work, earned him thousands of dollars in payments that he carefully invested in establishing his own criminal operations in Harlem, and expanded his network of contacts among major crime figures who controlled bootlegging, gambling, and other profitable enterprises across the Northeast. Most importantly, these assignments brought Johnson to the attention of Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, the 2 most important architects of organized crime's transition from Prohibition-era bootlegging to the more sophisticated national syndicate that would control gambling, drug trafficking, prostitution, and other illegal industries throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Luciano and Lansky, who'd been childhood friends growing up on the Lower East Side and who'd built their criminal empire through strategic alliances with Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangsters across ethnic lines, recognized that Johnson represented something potentially valuable, a colored criminal who was smart enough and ruthless enough to operate at high levels, while maintaining strong connections to Harlem's black community that the Italian and Jewish mobsters couldn't easily penetrate or control directly. In October 1930, at a meeting arranged by Anthony Grosso in a private room at Dinty Moore's restaurant on West 46th Street in Manhattan, Luciano told Johnson that the future of organized crime required cooperation across racial and ethnic boundaries, that the old-style gang warfare between Irish and Italian and Jewish mobs had been economically destructive and had attracted unwanted federal attention, that smarter criminals understood the advantages of creating structured arrangements where different groups controlled different territories and different industries, while cooperating on matters that affected everyone's interests. What Luciano was proposing, he explained while Lansky and Grosso and several other major crime figures listened carefully, was an informal advisory role for Johnson, participating in discussions about how to manage criminal operations in Harlem as Prohibition ended and the industry transitioned to other revenue sources, providing intelligence about opportunities and threats in the colored underworld, helping to facilitate agreements between white mob organizations and black policy operators that would benefit everyone while reducing violence and federal scrutiny.